The prisoner exchange was scheduled to take place in a remote valley that had been chosen for its accessibility to both sides and its distance from civilian populations. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of American helicopters growing louder as their vehicle approached the designated meeting point. After 10 days of captivity, those mechanical sounds represented freedom and the possibility of returning to her normal life. However, the exchange never happened. As Sarah's captors prepared to hand her over to coalition forces, urgent radio chatter began crackling through their communications equipment. Hassan's lieutenant rushed to his commander and spoke rapidly in a local dialect that Sarah could not understand. Whatever news he was delivering caused Hassan's expression to change dramatically from satisfaction to alarm. "There has been a complication," Hassan announced grimly. "Coalition forces have launched a major offensive against our positions throughout this entire region. The prisoner exchange has been canceled by my superiors, who now consider Captain Mitchell too valuable to release during active combat operations." Sarah felt her heart sink as her hopes of freedom evaporated once again. The sound of helicopters was now moving away from their location instead of approaching, confirming that the exchange had indeed been called off. She was being taken back into captivity just when rescue had seemed certain. The journey back to their mountain stronghold took place under very different circumstances than the trip to the exchange site. Coalition aircraft could be heard conducting operations throughout the region, and Hassan's men were clearly nervous about being caught in the open during daylight hours. They moved quickly through valleys and mountain passes, avoiding main roads and open areas where they might be spotted from the air. Sarah was returned to her original cell, but the atmosphere of her captivity had changed significantly. Her guards were now tense and alert, obviously concerned about the possibility of coalition forces discovering their location during the ongoing offensive operations. The compound that had seemed secure and hidden now felt exposed and vulnerable. Hassan visited her that evening with troubling news about the broader strategic situation. "Captain Mitchell, your military has launched what they are calling Operation Iron Hammer, a major offensive designed to clear insurgent forces from this entire mountain region. The timing of this operation, coinciding with our planned prisoner exchange, has convinced my commanders that the exchange was merely a deception designed to locate our positions." Sarah realized with growing concern that her situation had become much more dangerous. If Hassan's superiors believed the prisoner exchange had been a trick, they might decide she was too dangerous to keep alive. Military operations often created confusion and fear that could lead to tragic decisions made in haste rather than careful consideration. "I had nothing to do with planning any offensive operations," Sarah protested truthfully. "I've been in captivity for 10 days. I couldn't have provided information about your positions even if I wanted to." Hassan nodded agreement, but his expression remained troubled. "I believe you, Captain Mitchell, but my superiors are less trusting. They have ordered me to move you to a more secure location deeper in the mountains. The journey will be dangerous, and I cannot guarantee your safety if we encounter coalition forces during the movement." That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the distant sounds of combat operations. Explosions echoed through the mountains as coalition aircraft struck suspected insurgent positions, and occasional gunfire indicated ground contact between opposing forces. She realized that the offensive might actually decrease her chances of survival rather than increasing them. The next morning, Hassan's men began preparations to move her to the new location. Sarah was given slightly better clothing to protect against the mountain cold, and her captors seemed genuinely concerned about keeping her alive during what would obviously be a difficult journey through hostile terrain. "Captain Mitchell," Hassan said as they prepared to leave, "I want you to understand that I will do everything in my power to protect you during this movement. You have my word as a soldier that I will not allow harm to come to you if it is within my ability to prevent it." Sarah appreciated Hassan's assurance, but she also understood the limits of his control over the situation. If they encountered coalition forces during the journey, a firefight would be inevitable, and she could easily become a casualty in the confusion of combat. Her survival now depended on luck as much as on Hassan's good intentions. The journey began before dawn, with Sarah traveling in a small convoy of vehicles that would take them deeper into the mountain wilderness. She was blindfolded again, but She could sense the tension among her captors as they navigated roads that might be under surveillance by coalition aircraft or ground forces. After several hours of travel, the convoy was forced to stop when scouts reported coalition helicopters conducting search patterns ahead of their planned route. Sarah could hear Hassan conferring with his lieutenants about alternative paths that might avoid detection, but their options were clearly limited by the scope of the ongoing military operations. "We will have to continue on foot," Hassan decided finally. "The vehicles are too visible from the air, and the roads are too dangerous. Captain Mitchell, I hope you are prepared for a difficult mountain trek." Sarah's military training had included extensive hiking and survival skills, but she had been weakened by 10 days of poor nutrition and limited exercise. The prospect of a forced march through rough mountain terrain was daunting, but she knew she had to keep up with her captors or risk being left behind in the wilderness. The foot journey proved to be as challenging as Hassan had predicted. The group moved through rocky valleys and over steep ridges, constantly watching the sky for aircraft and listening for signs of coalition ground forces in the area. Sarah's legs ached from the unaccustomed exercise, but she forced herself to maintain the pace despite her physical limitations. On the second day of the trek, disaster struck. Coalition helicopters spotted their group as they crossed an open area between two mountain ridges. Hassan immediately ordered his men to take cover among the rocks and prepare for contact, but Sarah realized that her presence complicated their tactical situation significantly. "Captain Mitchell, you must stay close to me," Hassan ordered urgently. "If shooting begins, my men have been instructed to protect you at all costs, but the situation will be very dangerous." Sarah found herself in the surreal position of being protected by enemy fighters against her own country's military forces. The moral complexity of the situation was overwhelming, but her survival instincts took precedence over abstract ethical considerations. She took cover behind a large boulder and prepared for what seemed likely to be a violent confrontation. The helicopters began circling their position, obviously having spotted movement in the area, but not yet identifying specific targets. Hassan's men remained hidden among the rocks, their weapons ready but not yet firing. Everyone understood that the first shot would trigger a battle that could easily result in multiple casualties on both sides. Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear radio chatter from the helicopter crews as they attempted to identify the people hiding below. The pilots were professional and cautious, following rules of engagement that required positive identification before engaging targets. This military discipline might be the only thing preventing immediate violence. "Show yourself," Hassan whispered urgently to Sarah. "If they see you are American, they may not attack." Sarah realized that revealing herself to the helicopter crews would save Hassan's men from immediate attack, but it would also confirm her location to coalition forces. This information could lead to a rescue attempt, but it could also result in her being moved to an even more secure location or potentially being killed to prevent her rescue. The decision was taken out of her hands when one of Hassan's men accidentally triggered a small rock slide while changing position. The movement immediately drew fire from one of the helicopters, and the battle that everyone had hoped to avoid began with devastating intensity. Sarah pressed herself against the ground as automatic weapons fire and rocket explosions tore through the area around their position. Hassan's men returned fire with their assault rifles, but they were clearly outmatched by the firepower of the military helicopters. The noise was deafening, and dust and debris filled the air as projectiles struck the rocky terrain. In the chaos of the firefight, Sarah saw her opportunity. One of the helicopters had landed to deploy soldiers who would attempt to capture or kill the insurgent fighters. If she could reach the coalition forces, she might be able to identify herself and end her captivity. However, reaching them would mean crossing terrain that was being swept by gunfire from both sides. "Hassan," she called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "I'm going to try to reach my people." Hassan's face showed a mixture of concern and understanding. "Go, Captain Mitchell. This is your chance. I hope you make it safely." Sarah began moving from cover to cover, using rocks and terrain features to protect herself from the intense crossfire. Bullets ricocheted off stones around her as she worked her way toward the landed helicopter, and She could hear Hassan's men providing covering fire to protect her movement despite the fact that she was trying to escape from them. The absurdity of being protected by her captors while trying to reach her own forces was not lost on Sarah, but she focused entirely on survival and the possibility of freedom. Every yard of progress brought her closer to safety, but also exposed her to greater danger from the ongoing battle. She had covered about half the distance to the helicopter when she saw a coalition soldier taking aim in her direction. Sarah realized that from his position, she would appear to be another insurgent fighter trying to flank the American position. She was about to be shot by her own side unless she could identify herself immediately. "American soldier!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, raising her hands above her head despite the obvious danger this created. "I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Army. Don't shoot." The soldier's weapon remained trained on her, but he did not fire immediately. Through his tactical radio, Sarah could hear him reporting contact with someone claiming to be the missing American officer. The helicopter crew was apparently familiar with her situation because orders came back quickly to secure and extract her if her identity could be confirmed. "Serial number," the soldier shouted over the noise of continuing gunfire. 238475561. Sarah responded, providing the number she had given Hassan during interrogation sessions. The soldier's posture relaxed slightly, but he maintained his vigilance as he directed her toward the helicopter. "Move to the bird. Stay low and keep your hands visible." Sarah ran the final distance to the aircraft, where crew members immediately helped her aboard while the door gunners continued providing covering fire for the soldiers still engaged with Hassan's men. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked down at the battle still raging below and thought about Hassan's promise to protect her during their journey. The flight back to the forward operating base was back at the forward operating base. The news of Captain Mitchell's capture sent shockwaves through the command structure. Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, stood in the operations center staring at the tactical display that showed the last known position of Sarah's team. Red icons marked enemy positions while blue icons represented friendly forces, but one blue icon was conspicuously missing from the screen. Sergeant Rodriguez sat in the medical tent, his left arm in a sling from a bullet wound he had sustained during the firefight. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage and guilt as he recounted the events of the failed mission to the intelligence officers. 3 of his teammates had been killed in the ambush, 2 more were seriously wounded, and their captain was now in enemy hands. "Sir, we have to go back for her," Rodriguez said for the 10th time, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Captain Mitchell would never leave one of us behind. We can't abandon her now." Colonel Harrison understood Rodriguez's feelings, but he also had to consider the bigger picture. A hasty rescue attempt could result in more casualties and potentially get Captain Mitchell killed. They needed intelligence about where she was being held and a carefully planned operation with sufficient resources to ensure success. "Sergeant, I know how you feel, but we need to be smart about this," Harrison replied patiently. "Captain Mitchell is a tough soldier, and she's been trained for this kind of situation. We're going to get her back, but we're going to do it right." The intelligence team was already working frantically to locate Sarah's position. They analyzed radio intercepts, studied satellite imagery, and reached out to local assets who might have information about insurgent movements in the area. Every available resource was being directed toward finding one missing American soldier. Meanwhile, Sarah was learning about the harsh realities of captivity. Her cell was cold and damp, and her captors provided only minimal food and water. Hassan visited her twice each day, attempting to extract military information through a combination of psychological pressure and implied threats. So far, Sarah had resisted all attempts at interrogation, providing only her name, rank, and serial number as required by military protocol. On the 3rd day of her captivity, Hassan arrived with a new approach. Instead of questions about military operations, he began talking about the broader political situation in Afghanistan. He spoke about foreign intervention and the right of his people to resist occupation. Sarah listened without responding, knowing that engaging in political discussions could be used against her later. "You are a soldier, Captain Mitchell, not a politician," Hassan said during one of these sessions. "You follow orders without questioning whether those orders serve the interests of the Afghan people or merely the ambitions of your government. Do you ever wonder if you are fighting on the wrong side of this conflict? Sarah maintained her silence, but Hassan's words forced her to confront questions she had sometimes asked herself during quiet moments between missions. She believed in her country and her duty as a soldier, but she also understood that war was never as simple as the briefings made it seem. Good people suffered on all sides of any conflict, and the moral certainties of training often became blurred in the reality of combat. Your silence tells me that you are intelligent enough to recognize the complexity of our situation, Hassan continued. This gives me hope that we might eventually have a productive conversation about matters of mutual interest. After Hassan left, Sarah found herself alone with thoughts that she usually kept buried beneath layers of military discipline and professional focus. She thought about her family back home, about the soldiers who had died under her command, and about the civilians caught in the crossfire of a conflict they had never chosen. Captivity had given her too much time to think about things beyond her immediate survival. The physical conditions of her imprisonment were taking their toll as well. The limited food was weakening her body, and the lack of sunlight was affecting her mental state. Sarah knew she needed to maintain her physical fitness as much as possible if she hoped to escape or survive a rescue attempt. So she developed a routine of exercises she could perform in the confined space of her cell. On the 5th day, Hassan arrived with disturbing news. Captain Mitchell, your government has been informed of your capture through intermediaries. They have been given terms for your release, but I fear their response has not been encouraging. Sarah felt her heart sink, though she tried not to show any reaction. She knew that official policy prohibited negotiating with terrorists, but she had hoped that her value as an officer might prompt some kind of exception to that rule. The silence from her own government was more demoralizing than anything her captors had done to her. Do not despair, Hassan said, seeming to read her thoughts. Your government's public position and their private actions are often very different things. Negotiations may still bear fruit, but these things take time. In the meantime, I encourage you to consider your situation carefully. That night, Sarah lay awake in her cell thinking about escape. She had studied every inch of her prison during the daylight hours, looking for weaknesses that might be exploited. The cell door was thick wood reinforced with metal bands, secured by a heavy lock on the outside. The walls were solid rock with no visible cracks or loose stones. The opening overhead was too small and too high to reach even if she could stand on something. Her guards followed a predictable routine, bringing food twice a day and checking on her every few hours during daylight. There were usually 2 guards present, and they remained alert and professional in their duties. Sarah noted that they respected her as a fellow soldier, even though they considered her an enemy. This professional courtesy might be something she could use to her advantage if the right opportunity presented itself. The sound of distant gunfire reached her cell on the 7th day of captivity. The noise was sporadic but persistent, suggesting a sustained firefight somewhere in the mountains above her underground prison. Sarah's heart raced with the possibility that this might be a rescue attempt, but the sounds gradually faded without any change in her situation. Hassan arrived soon after the gunfire stopped, and his expression was more serious than usual. There has been contact with coalition forces in the area, he informed her. Your people are looking for you, Captain Mitchell, but they are searching in the wrong places. This compound where you are being held has remained secret for many years. Sarah felt disappointment wash over her, but she also felt pride in knowing that her soldiers were risking their lives to bring her home. Rodriguez and the others had not abandoned her, just as she would never have abandoned them in similar circumstances. The knowledge that rescue attempts were being made gave her strength to continue resisting her captors. Your rescue will not come from outside, Hassan continued. If you wish to leave this place alive, you must earn your freedom through cooperation. I am not asking you to betray your country, merely to acknowledge the legitimacy of our struggle against foreign occupation. Sarah understood that Hassan was offering her a way out that would minimize loss of face for both sides. If she agreed to make some kind of political statement acknowledging his perspective, she might be released without having revealed military secrets. However, she also knew that any statement she made would be used for propaganda purposes and could potentially endanger other coalition forces operating in the region. I am a soldier, not a politician, Sarah replied. using Hassan's own words from their earlier conversations. "I don't have the authority to make political statements on behalf of my government." Hassan nodded as if he had expected this response. "Perhaps not. But you have the authority to speak for yourself." A simple acknowledgement of the humanity and legitimate grievances of the Afghan people would be sufficient. No military secrets, no betrayal of your oath, just recognition that this conflict has created suffering on all sides. That night, Sarah wrestled with the most difficult decision of her military career. Hassan was offering her a path to freedom that seemed reasonable and relatively harmless. But she knew that any cooperation with her captors could set a dangerous precedent. Future captured soldiers might face increased pressure if it became known that officers could be induced to make political statements under duress. The next morning brought devastating news. Hassan arrived with a grim expression and a transcript of a radio intercept from coalition forces. During the previous day's rescue attempt, 2 American soldiers had been killed and several others wounded. Sarah recognized one of the names on the casualty list, a young corporal who had served under her command during her previous deployment. "This blood is on your hands, Captain Mitchell," Hassan said quietly. "These soldiers died because of your stubborn refusal to accept a reasonable offer of release. How many more will die before you acknowledge that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than pointless resistance?" Sarah felt the weight of command responsibility crushing down on her. She had always known that her decisions could result in casualties, but the abstract knowledge was very different from hearing the names of specific soldiers who had died trying to rescue her. The guilt was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to think rationally about the situation. Any rescue attempts would have been authorized at levels far above her pay grade. The soldiers who had died were following orders from their commanders, just as she had followed orders that led to her capture. The responsibility for their deaths lay with the enemy fighters who had killed them, not with her refusal to cooperate with her captors. Every soldier who volunteers for military service accepts the risk of death in combat, Sarah replied with as much composure as she could manage. "Those men died doing their duty, just as I am doing mine by refusing to be used for propaganda purposes." Hassan studied her face carefully, as if searching for signs of weakness or doubt. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Captain Mitchell. Perhaps both. I hope for your sake that your government values your life more than their political principles." After Hassan left, Sarah allowed herself a few minutes of private grief for the soldiers who had died. She had known Corporal Williams personally, and she remembered his enthusiasm for the mission and his pride in serving his country. He had been barely 20 years old, with a girlfriend back home, and dreams of attending college after his military service ended. The emotional toll of captivity was becoming as difficult to bear as the physical deprivation. Sarah found herself thinking constantly about her family, her soldiers, and the choices that had brought her to this underground cell. She wondered if she would ever see her home again, or if she would become another casualty statistic in a conflict that seemed to have no clear end in sight. On the 10th day, Hassan brought news that changed everything. "Captain Mitchell, I have received word that your government has agreed to a prisoner exchange. 24 insurgent fighters currently held at Bagram Airfield will be released in return for your freedom." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and concern. She was grateful for the possibility of release, but she worried about the implications of trading her life for the freedom of enemy fighters who might return to the battlefield. The moral complexity of the situation was troubling, but she also recognized that such decisions were far above her level of authority. "When?" she asked simply. "The exchange will take place in 3 days at a location to be determined by neutral parties," Hassan replied. "I trust you will not attempt anything foolish during the remaining time of your captivity. Your freedom is now assured, provided both sides honor their commitments." For the first time since her capture, Sarah allowed herself to hope that she might survive this ordeal. The prospect of returning to her unit and her family seemed almost too good to believe after 10 days of uncertainty and fear. However, she also knew that prisoner exchanges were complex operations that could go wrong in countless ways. The next 3 days passed slowly as Sarah waited for her release. She continued her exercise routine and maintained her mental discipline, knowing that she needed to be as strong as possible for whatever challenges lay ahead. The prisoner exchange would likely take place in hostile territory, and there was always the possibility that something could go wrong at the last moment. Hassan visited her one final time on the morning of the exchange. "Captain Mitchell, you have conducted yourself with honor during your captivity. I respect your dedication to your principles, even though I disagree with your cause. I hope that when this war eventually ends, soldiers like you and I might meet under more pleasant circumstances." Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his words. Despite everything that had happened, she had developed a grudging respect for Hassan as a professional soldier and leader. He had treated her according to his own moral code, even while holding her against her will. War created strange relationships between enemies who might have been friends under different circumstances. "I hope you find the peace you're fighting for," Sarah replied, meaning the words despite everything she had endured. As her guards led her from the cell for the last time, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at her impending freedom was tempered by awareness that 24 enemy fighters would soon be free to return to combat against coalition forces. The moral implications of the exchange would trouble her for years to come, but she was grateful to be alive and to have the chance to return to her family and her soldiers. The journey to the exchange site took several hours through mountain paths that Sarah tried to memorize in case the intelligence might prove useful later. She was blindfolded for most of the trip, but she was able to gather some information about the terrain and the route through sound and the movement of the vehicle that transported her. As they approached the exchange location, Sarah could hear helicopters in the distance and radio chatter from what sounded like coalition forces. After 10 days of captivity, the familiar sounds of American military operations were among the most beautiful things she had ever heard. Her ordeal was finally coming to an end, but she knew the memories of these 10 days would stay with her for the rest of her life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains as Captain Sarah Mitchell checked her radio one last time. Her team of 12 soldiers had been tracking a high-value target through these treacherous peaks for 3 days. Intelligence reports indicated that Commander Hassan Malik, a key figure in the regional insurgency, was hiding in a compound just 2 kilometers ahead. Sarah had earned her rank through years of dedicated service and countless dangerous missions. At 32, she was one of the youngest female captains in her unit, but her tactical brilliance and unwavering courage had earned the respect of every soldier under her command. Her green eyes reflected the determination that had carried her through multiple deployments, and her steady hands never trembled, even in the most dangerous situations. The mission seemed straightforward enough. Satellite imagery showed a small compound nestled between 2 rocky ridges, with minimal security and limited escape routes. The plan was to approach from 3 directions, secure the perimeter, and extract the target before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Sarah had executed similar operations dozens of times before, but something felt different about this one. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, her second-in-command, moved up beside her as they crouched behind a boulder. His weathered face showed concern as he studied the compound through his binoculars. Rodriguez had served with Sarah for over 2 years, and he knew her well enough to recognize when she was troubled. "Captain, the approach looks clean, but I'm getting a bad feeling about this," Rodriguez whispered, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "The compound looks too quiet. Where are the guards we saw in yesterday's surveillance?" Sarah took the binoculars and scanned the area carefully. Rodriguez was right. The compound appeared almost deserted, which was highly unusual for a location housing such an important target. Most insurgent hideouts maintained constant security, with armed guards positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. This place looked abandoned. "Maybe they moved him during the night," suggested Private Davis, the team's communications specialist. "Could be we're looking at an empty building." Sarah considered this possibility, but her instincts told her otherwise. Years of experience had taught her to trust her gut feelings. And right now, everything inside her was screaming that this was a trap. However, they had traveled too far and invested too much time to abandon the mission based on intuition alone. Command was expecting results, and Hassan Malik was too valuable a target to let slip away. "We proceed as planned," Sarah decided, her voice carrying the authority that had made her an effective leader. "But stay extra alert. If this is a trap, we need to be ready to adapt quickly. The team split into 3 groups as rehearsed. Rodriguez led the northern approach with 4 soldiers, while Corporal Thompson took 3 men around to the south. Sarah commanded the remaining 4 soldiers in a direct frontal assault once the flanking teams were in position. Each group carried enough firepower to handle significant resistance, and their radio equipment would keep them connected throughout the operation. As Sarah's team crept closer to the compound, the silence became increasingly unsettling. No birds sang in the nearby trees, no insects buzzed in the morning air, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the soft crunch of boots on rocky ground as the soldiers moved with practiced stealth toward their objective. The compound consisted of 3 main buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Satellite imagery had identified the largest structure as the most likely location for their target, but Sarah knew they would need to search all 3 buildings to ensure a thorough operation. The walls appeared to be made of local stone and dried mud, typical construction for the region, with small windows that would provide limited visibility into the interior spaces. Northern team in position. Rodriguez's voice crackled through Sarah's earpiece. No movement visible. Awaiting your signal. Southern team ready. Thompson reported a moment later. All quiet on this side too, Captain. Sarah felt her unease growing stronger, but she pushed the feeling aside. Professional soldiers learned to function despite their fears, and she had never let anxiety compromise a mission before. She raised her hand to signal her team, then spoke quietly into her radio. All teams, this is command. Execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1 mark. The assault began with swift precision. Sarah's team rushed toward the main entrance while the flanking teams moved to secure the rear exits. The front door was unlocked, which immediately raised another red flag in Sarah's mind. Enemy fighters never left their strongholds unsecured, especially when they knew coalition forces were operating in the area. Inside the main building, the team found signs of recent occupation. Cooking fires were still warm, personal belongings were scattered around sleeping areas, and the smell of food lingered in the air. However, there were no people anywhere to be found. It was as if the occupants had simply vanished into thin air. Building 1 clear, Sarah reported as her team finished searching the main structure. No hostiles, no target. Moving to Building 2. The second building yielded similar results. Recent signs of habitation, but no actual inhabitants. Sarah was beginning to suspect that intelligence had been wrong about the location when Rodriguez's voice suddenly burst through her radio with urgent intensity. Contact! Contact! We've got multiple hostiles approaching from the North Ridge. They're moving to surround us. Sarah looked through a window and saw armed fighters streaming down the mountainside from positions that should have been empty. There were far more enemies than intelligence had indicated, and they were clearly executing a coordinated ambush. The trap had been sprung, and her team was caught in the middle of it. All teams, fall back to the main building, Sarah ordered, her training taking over despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. We need to establish a defensive position immediately. The next few minutes descended into chaos. Enemy fighters poured into the compound from multiple directions, their automatic weapons filling the air with deadly gunfire. Sarah's team fought back with fierce determination, but they were outnumbered by at least 3-1. The tactical advantage that had seemed so clear from the satellite images had been completely reversed. Rodriguez and his team fought their way back toward the main building, but they came under heavy fire as they crossed the open courtyard. Private Johnson took a bullet in the shoulder and stumbled to the ground. Rodriguez immediately moved to help him, but more enemy fighters appeared on the rooftops above, forcing the entire team to take cover behind whatever shelter they could find. We need air support, Thompson called through the radio, his voice strained with effort as he returned fire from his position near the southern wall. There are too many of them. Sarah knew that air support would take at least 20 minutes to arrive, assuming the request could even get through to command. The mountains interfered with radio communications, and she wasn't certain their call for help would reach headquarters in time to make a difference. Her team needed to hold their position and fight their way out using their own resources. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Sarah's soldiers fought with the skill and courage that had made them an elite unit. But the enemy numbers seemed endless. For every fighter they neutralized, two more appeared to take his place. The situation was becoming desperate. Then, disaster struck. An enemy rocket-propelled grenade exploded near the main building's entrance, collapsing part of the wall and filling the air with dust and debris. In the confusion that followed, Sarah found herself separated from most of her team. When the dust settled, she realized with growing horror that she was surrounded by enemy fighters who had managed to penetrate their defensive perimeter. The last thing Sarah remembered before losing consciousness was the butt of an assault rifle striking the back of her head. As darkness claimed her vision, she heard Rodriguez screaming her name through the radio, his voice filled with desperation and rage. The mission had failed catastrophically, and now the hunters had become the hunted. When Sarah finally regained consciousness, she found herself in a dark, cramped space that smelled of dampness and decay. Her hands were bound behind her back with rough rope that cut into her wrists, and her head throbbed with pain from the blow that had knocked her unconscious. It took several moments for her eyes to adjust to the dim light filtering through a small opening high above her head. She was in some kind of underground cell, probably carved out of the mountain rock itself. The walls were rough stone, and the floor was covered with dirty straw that did little to provide comfort or warmth. A metal bucket in the corner served as primitive sanitation, and the only source of light came from that single opening far overhead. As her mind cleared, Sarah began to assess her situation with the methodical thinking that had served her well throughout her military career. She was alive, which meant her captors wanted her for something more than just killing another enemy soldier. They had taken considerable risk to capture her during the battle, suggesting she had value to them beyond simple revenge. Her captors had removed her weapons, radio, and most of her equipment, but they had left her in her uniform. This suggested they might want to use her for propaganda purposes, perhaps forcing her to make statements that could be broadcast to damage coalition morale or embarrass her home country. Sarah had undergone extensive training on how to resist interrogation and propaganda efforts, but she knew the reality would be much more difficult than any training scenario. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through what seemed to be a tunnel or corridor beyond her cell. Sarah forced herself to sit up straighter, drawing on her military bearing to project strength even in these dire circumstances. She would not give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing fear or despair, no matter what they had planned for her. A heavy wooden door creaked open, and 3 men entered her cell. The first was clearly the leader, a tall man with intelligent eyes and a carefully groomed beard. He wore traditional Afghan clothing but carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. The other 2 men were guards, armed with assault rifles, and watching Sarah with suspicious hostility. "Captain Sarah Mitchell," the leader said in accented but clear English. "You are far from home, and your situation is quite grave. I am Commander Hassan Malik, the man you came here to capture. Instead, you have become my prisoner." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. This was indeed their target, the high-value insurgent leader they had risked so much to apprehend. The irony of the situation was not lost on her, but she refused to show any reaction that might please her captors or suggest weakness on her part. "I am Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Army," she replied formally, providing only the information required by the Geneva Conventions regarding prisoners of war. Serial number 238475561. "That is all I am required to tell you." Hassan smiled coldly, as if he had expected exactly this response. "The Geneva Conventions are a luxury for conventional armies fighting conventional wars, Captain. We are engaged in a struggle for the very survival of our homeland against foreign invaders. Different rules apply here." Sarah knew she was in serious trouble, but she also knew that her training and determination might be enough to keep her alive until rescue arrived. Somewhere out there, Rodriguez and the surviving members of her team would be working frantically to locate her and mount a rescue operation. She just had to survive long enough for them to find her. The psychological battle between captor and prisoner had begun, and Sarah prepared herself for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging test of her life. Everything she had learned, every ounce of courage she possessed, would be needed in the days ahead. The mission had failed, but her personal fight for survival was just beginning.